weed control portion of the program, I want to focus on late season weed issues. And one of our main issues is morning glory at the end of the corn crop. And this particular spot I'm standing is on the end of a field, but it can also be a problem anywhere in the middle of the field where we lose early control of the morning glory species. And so this time of year, I get a lot of calls on what can we do about these field ends that are covered in morning glory, or if we have an entire field that may have a problem. And so there are a couple of harvest aids labeled for this situation. Paraquat or Gramoxone is labeled for harvest aid in corn, AIM, and sodium chlorate. So those are the three that we have that we can use as potential harvest aids at the end of the corn season. When we talk about Paraquat, in the past we've had a couple of different formulations. The Gramoxone 2-pound formulation we can put up to a pint. We need some surfactant with that. If we're talking about a 3-pound formulation of Paraquat, that rate's going to be about 1 1/3 pints. And so 1 1/3 pints of 3 pounds or 2 pints of the 2-pound Paraquat formulation. Again, we want to put a non-ionic surfactant with that. Also, we could mix some sodium chlorate with that, at least 3 pounds of sodium chlorate up to 6 pounds. The other option, which is the one most go-to, I would say, in a corn scenario, is AIM, or carfentrazone. So with AIM, we need to look at 2 ounces per acre plus 1% crop oil, and for good measure, I'd throw in at least 3 pounds of sodium chlorate. And again, we could go up to 6 pounds of that if we wanted to. Now, why do I say most go with AIM? Well, corn, in a corn crop scenario, most of that's going to go out via airplane. So if we're using airplane to make the application, we have a lot of crops around in the area that are going to be very sensitive to the Paraquat application. And so we want to be mindful before we recommend a harvest aid in corn, or any crop really, of our surroundings. And so if we have cotton that's nearby, if we've got rice that's nearby, soybeans that aren't mature, anything that hasn't reached physiological maturity can be susceptible to drift from these harvest aid applications. And so again, AIM is probably a little less injurious from a drift standpoint than the Paraquat's going to be, and therefore again, that's why most of the aerial applicators will more likely put out the AIM or sodium chlorate than they will the Paraquat or Gramoxone. And again, with AIM, we're going to need 2 ounces plus 1% crop oil. Now, that's not going to completely kill all of these vines, but our main goal in this is we want that corn to feed through the combine easier and not tangle up our heads and cause a big mess or a big clog on the front end of the combine and cause us some equipment issues. So the main idea is we want to brittle this vine down enough to where we can cut through it with our combine, with our corn head, and not have any clogging or any issues on our equipment, because we don't want anything to impede our harvest or cause some issues on our equipment. And so again, if we want to think back of our herbicide program, is there anything we could have done different to not have this morning glory issue? You know, the majority of our growers and consultants recommend a one-shot program in corn. And I can make a one-shot program very effective for most weeds, especially when I'm protecting yield. But that doesn't mean that we're going to have season-long protection. And so we really need to think about a multiple application or 2-shot program for morning glories in fields we have morning glory issues. And some of the best residuals we have for these morning glory issues are atrazine and products that contain mesotrione or Callisto. So anything with Callisto or mesotrione in it, plus atrazine, you know, either in a drop nozzle scenario would be best, but in our final post application, that's going to give us our best residual for morning glories and hopefully prevent some of the problem like we see right here. Now I want to talk a little bit about seed bank management and how important it is, especially for pigweed, that we focus on that seed bank and make sure that once we cut our corn crop, we remove any escapes after we're done with harvest. Now, as you can see, overall, this particular herbicide treatment did a very good job. This is what is one of our standard herbicide treatments we compare others to in corn. This was dual at 1 1/3 pints, applied at planting, followed by Halex GT and atrazine at V4. Okay, and so overall, especially with the heavy rain that we got this year, we're at Tiller, Arkansas, so we received over 18 inches of rain at one time, or at least in a couple day period earlier in the year. So I'm really impressed that it did this good considering we had all that rain. But we still have a pigweed escape here. There's a morning glory escape. Overall, we've got a good plot. You know, if I'm in a big field and this is all I have, I'm probably not worried about a harvest aid from this standpoint, but I do need to be focused on this pigweed plant. Corn is an excellent rotation for cotton and soybeans, especially because we can use different herbicides in our corn crop than we can those other two. But we really need to stay focused on our seed bank management at the end of the season on pigweed. And so once we harvest this corn crop, this little guy right here, and he's really not that little, he's 2.5 feet tall more or less, is going to cause us a problem. And it's going to cause us a problem because this corn will be gone. This guy's going to keep growing and produce a fairly large seed head because he's not going to have any competition, and he'll have a lot of time to grow before our kill and frost. And so we need to focus on fields where we have these escapes. It's not uncommon. Every field may have one or two here or there, but if we only have one per acre, that's still too many. And so we want to come in here. You know, we talk about the timeliness of palmer management or pigweed management in season. We're focused on a 4 to 5 inch tall pigweed or less. So using a herbicide to control this escape is not a viable option. So the best option after harvest is to come in here with some tillage or a shredder, followed by tillage sometime before this pigweed plant or other pigweeds in the field can produce a viable seed. And again, they'll have plenty of time to do that before killing frost. So moving in here following harvest with the shredder, and then in 2 weeks followed by tillage, or going ahead and coming back with tillage and rebedding our rows for next year is going to be the best way to get a handle and control this pigweed and manage that palmer seed bank management, or manage that palmer seed bank. And again, this guy at the end, before a frost, can produce easily up to 100,000 seed, one plant. Okay, now I want to move and talk a little bit about fall residuals to help us with our ryegrass problem and our Italian ryegrass problem that we had this past season. So when I look back at 2021 or the 2021 growing season, it was one of the worst I can remember for issues with Italian ryegrass. Italian ryegrass is a winter annual. We used to battle it heavily in our wheat production when we had over 1 million acres of wheat. My graduate student project as a master's was on Italian ryegrass. So it's not a problem that we're not aware of. It just hasn't been a huge problem since we moved out of a lot of the wheat growing acres to more of our summer crops. But 2021, Italian ryegrass, more specifically glyphosate resistant Italian ryegrass, was a huge issue across the whole state. Now the last several years down in Tiller where I'm at today, it's been a pretty big problem for the last 4 or 5 years. It just hadn't seemed to spread much north of here, but that changed in 2021. So now is the time of year that we need to be thinking about Italian ryegrass management. And so a crop like corn that we're focused on today is an early planted crop. So we're looking at an early planting window, meaning that it's very likely that when we plant, this corn could compete with Italian ryegrass when it's coming out of the ground. And when we look at data from Mississippi State and other places, that's not something that we want. We can lose yield with that competition. And so now's the time to think about management of ryegrass. Now, I've mentioned most of it's glyphosate resistant. We haven't done a screening program in a while. We're in the process of doing that now. And we will confirm that the bulk of it we think is glyphosate resistant. Some of it may be resistant to clethodim or select. So we're trying to get a gauge on what products we have that will control it if it is up out of the ground. But before we deal with it in the spring, it's much easier to deal with in the fall. And so out of my research as a master's degree, the best thing to manage ryegrass was to kill that first flush coming up out of the ground. If we could kill that first flush, you know, it may be 80% of the ryegrass that we have to deal with in the spring. And so killing that first flush is critical. To do that, we can use tillage, we can use non-selective products like paraquat or gramoxone. When I was doing the research, we used Roundup, but Roundup's not going to work on most of these populations. Clethodim is an option, or Select is an option if the particular field in question doesn't have Select resistance. So hopefully with our screening program, we're going to figure it out. Regardless, we need to kill that first flush or prevent it from coming up, and then we need to use residuals. Okay? Residuals activated at the right time can prevent that first flush from causing us problems. The critical point in that, though, is timing. Ryegrass is going to germinate based on temperature fluctuation, and so it's hard to just nail down when those residual applications need to go out. Many times it may be easier to tank mix a paraquat with the residual to kill what's up, and then we know we have residual barrier down for any more germination through the fall and winter. Now, these fall residuals, the products we're talking about, are in our Group 15 class of chemistry. So metolachlor, specifically any product with S-metolachlor, acetochlor, peroxysulfone such as Zidua. Those three products are going to be our main products that we use from a residual standpoint, especially if we're talking about planting crops like corn, cotton, or soybean in the spring. Now, if it's a field that's going to rice, we need to be careful when we use those products because most of them have, if not all of them, they have a restriction on planting back following those applications. And so we can get into some trouble with a reduced rice stand if we try to plant rice in the field where we've used these residual Group 15s. So we're in the process of hopefully getting a 24C for clomazone or Command, specifically to use in the fall, meaning we'll have an increased total rate that we can use for a season, but using that Command in the fall on the fields that may go to rice that next spring for control of this ryegrass. So just to sum up what we need to do, if you see a flush, we need to kill it, kill that first flush. We need to use a residual herbicide. Now, if I'm trying to time it where I use those residuals prior to that first flush coming up, there's no magic date I can tell you. It's going to be sometime between October 15th and November 15th most years. So on average around the 1st of November, we need to have it on our mind if we hadn't got those out yet. You don't want to go too early because they will break down in the hot temperatures in September, early October before we need them through the fall. So they won't last as long if we go too early. We want the temperatures to be cool. We want the microbial activity to not be as high so those residuals last longer through the winter. And again, getting that first flush is critical in overall ryegrass management. If we wait to the spring, it's going to take 2 applications of either clethodim or paraquat, something with paraquat in it, to beat the populations back enough where we can reduce that competition. And we sure don't want to wait until we see those ryegrass plants start joining or start moving into the reproductive phase because they're extremely hard to control at that point. So keep in mind, it's hard to spend money in the fall, but this time of year is when we need to be thinking about our Italian ryegrass management. So I want to thank you for listening today, and if you have any questions, we'll have a time for that later following the presentation.